mute, your WhatsApp tab on the browser is closed, and any electronic devices around you are on silent or no sound mode. These sessions are being recorded, and screenshots will be taken for documentation and dissemination purposes. Hope we have your consent for the same. Also, to avoid any disturbance during the talk on Google Meet, I'll be sharing a Google Doc link where you can put in your thoughts and questions. Lastly, if it is convenient for you, we request that the participants may keep their videos on during the session. I would now request Ishita to tell us about today's plan and introduce us to Sophia.
Thank you, Vallabi. Thank you, Sophia, for joining us today. We are quite thrilled about this plan. And just to give everyone else who is new to the space a quick brief into what's happening here. So, at Curating for Culture, we have been running a 4-month long program called Constructing Personal Archives. And we had handpicked 20 projects, 20 exciting projects and professionals who have come together to build their own archiving projects. What we had in mind and what has sort of fallen through is we have sort of scaffolded their projects through a series of workshops as well as open dialogues. Workshops were pertaining to specific technical tools or requirements of an archive building exercise, whereas the open dialogues is where we actually invited experts and professionals from the field, like people who have more experience of having worked with archival material or having faced challenges behind behind the scenes. So over here we are in our third month. November 2020 is third month. We are actually closing the third month, and we move on to the fourth phase after this. So this is exactly the time when we needed a curator to come and speak with us. How do you work with archives and archival material? So we have with us Sophia Balagamwala. I should obviously address the personal or the formal introduction, but before that, a quick recap into how we met. So it's completely been a lockdown introduction for us. I got introduced to Sophia because I was invited to speak at BNU University, Beacon National University at Pakistan. And Sophia was one of the participants where we were talking about community engagement. And I think that sort of just clicked for us because over there we were talking about these different archival tools and how we have worked with those tools for educational purposes or different kind of projects. And Sophia told us briefly about her work with Citizens Archive at Pakistan. And we reached out to her to know more about her work as an artist and a curator. Quick introduction would be that she's also worked as a curator for National History Museum in Lahore. She's also been an advisor to, or she is an advisor to the Lok Virsa Museum. So when we spoke about, we have this third space for an open dialogue, we actually deliberated because our actual intention first was to say, let's have an archivist speak to us. And Sophia was honest to say that I'm not really an archivist. I will be talking about curation. That's what my space is. And we suddenly saw the parallels between the program and how a curator would be a better fit, so that we move from the space of an archive to a space of museum or a space of showcase and display. So it turned out to be the perfect shift into our own plans, and Sophia accepted our invitation. Our curatorial projects also include Soft Bodies 2018 and Kurachee, a platform that facilitates animation, illustration, and design collaborations and workshops. She also teaches at the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture. So we have Sophia with us with a very diverse set of practices, and we're quite excited to have you here, Sophia. Um, I also know that apart from the participants from Constructing Personal Archives, we have about a few interesting professionals as well in the audience, and we can perhaps get to know them in the question answer session. The format is very straightforward. I wrap up in another minute or so, and after that, Sophia takes her time to present and take us through her journey. She's titled it From Archives to Museum. And after that, we leave a space of few minutes for everybody to articulate their thoughts. Put down your questions in the link that Vallabi would have shared with you in the chat. I will take on the first part of the conversation with some specific questions that I might have in mind. But yes, of course, if the participants have more questions and more voice out there, I will sort of happily take a back seat and moderate the conversation between the participants, audience, and Sophia. So that's the plan for the evening. Sophia, over to you.
Thank you so much for this invitation to this extraordinary set of conversations that you've been having. I've not tuned in live to any of them, but I have listened to a number of them, watched a number of them online, and I'm truly humbled to be part of this. And I hope I can contribute meaningfully with my practice and work. So to give you a little bit of context first, this is a specific case study, almost sort of a talk. So I'm speaking about a very specific archive that I have worked with, and then how I've worked with the archive, and then how the contents of the archive have been have been disseminated specifically into exhibition spaces and a specific museum. So that will be the focus, and it's not a technical talk at all. It's case specific. So I hope it leads to more questions with the group here, or as Ishita, I love the word you use, provocations, which is what you hope whenever you're working on a project, that it does lead to more conversation and opens up questions. Um, so I'll start with because there are people interested in different types of archiving and projects. I'll start with the background of the archive. It's called the Citizens Archive of Pakistan. Could somebody
Yes.
just confirm it's visible? All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the archive is called the Citizens Archive of Pakistan. It was founded in 2008 by a group of these young 20 to 30 something year olds, a doctor, not a doctor, sorry, a lawyer, an accountant, a filmmaker, a graphic designer, an artist. They've all aged a lot since then, as have all of us who worked in archiving, I feel. And it started with very humble origins in the homes of one of their parents on a dining table. And and the initial aim was simply to collect the stories of the migrants from India to Pakistan, to collect these partition stories before the tellers of these stories moved on or passed away, the aging partition generation, and to scan some of their memorabilia, so their letters, their photographs. Then it expanded into hiring a few employees, collecting more and more stories. And this was again through word of mouth initially, through nominations. What about your grandparents? What about your aunt? What about your uncle? Is there anyone you know who is above this certain age? Is there anyone who you know who migrated or even didn't migrate, was here in 47? What was happening? And then the aim expanded a little bit. The small organization became a non-profit. It started to work with different local but mainly international grants, and state and non-state institutions both. And then the aims also expanded to collect stories in more languages, in more regions, to collect stories of minorities, specifically of women, and to just sort of expand the theme of the stories. So sort of to categorize them into different kinds of stories almost. So, the migration stories, but then specifically from different communities, from different experiences, from all different walks of life. And then the digitization also increased, and that became scanning a lot of publications which were only in print but not digitized. So different magazines and newspapers in languages, again, English, Urdu, but also beyond that, like Gujarati magazines, different things that were disappearing and that had no other record apart from their print form. And then other aims sort of emerged to include stories about specific events in our history that are again left out of the mainstream narrative or not covered appropriately in, say, a Pakistani textbook or a television show. So for example, 1971 or the 65 war. This was a very sort of straightforward narrative that was presented. 1971 had like a very small paragraph in history books. So to focus on these subjects, get stories from sort of the other side, although limited, the focus was still on the stories here, but to expand, to sort of rupture what we knew about these stories and expand our knowledge base of them through collecting different oral histories and voices. The initial set of people who worked on oral histories, they received some training from the British Library. So they went to London and they received training. And then since then, there have been a lot of professionals who've come in. There have been a lot of examples that we've looked at, a lot of different frameworks that we've learned from and experimented. But what often has happened, and we've learned this through trial and error, is that it becomes it's more successful that when the example or the framework is studied and then sort of localized to suit what we're trying to do to suit the local team and the local context. So a lot of the systems that we have in place, they are sort of hybrids and localized to suit what we are trying to do. So a few things that happen at CAP, it's Citizens Archive of Pakistan. I'm going to refer to it as CAP from here on, shorter. So first is the collection process. So that's the collecting of oral histories and the other kinds of memorabilia and digitization of these different things. Then obviously the long process of cataloging, archiving, and digitizing everything. And then there's a design team. So the curation, research, and design takes place. And then where I come in, or my role is somewhere between research, design, and then dissemination. And the dissemination has taken very different forms in our journey. So from very, very small spaces. So you can see the size of the structure here on the right in comparison to these buildings and these two men sitting on a bench. So this is one of our smallest models of dissemination. It's in Karachi at Frere Hall. This was one of our pop-up slash mobile museums. So it featured a little oral history booth, shade because it's very hot there, a bench to sit on, and then some archival footage. And the language was sort of, very trying to engage the passerby, like aake dekhiye, zara dekhiye, come and have a look, come and have a listen. So there were about 5 or 6 of these at different historical sites around the city. Um, this is another example. So again, you can see the scale of this, very small. This is at the Karachi cantonment train station. And this is again, these are actually two versions of it. Such a small space, we eventually had to change what was happening because we got feedback from those working at the railway station that they were getting bored. So then we had another exhibit. And you can see how small this is. And this particular train station, um, it was being conserved. It was going through a conservation and preservation process. So we worked with a wonderful heritage consultant who advised us on how to actually install this small space without harming the original building, and with working with her conservation guidelines. And again, there's a mix of oral histories, video, interaction, some images, some games. So very small place, but sort of sharing the history of that space. It's a train station, so you can imagine the types of stories we have from this train station itself, and many more that then could be added. And then we have temporary exhibitions. So this is this is one traveling exhibition. It went to Karachi and Lahore in 2011 and 2012. And this was within this. There was one at Indus Valley, an art institution in Karachi, one at the NCA in Lahore. It traveled thereafter. So these were temporary exhibitions of 2 weeks to a month. At this point, we'd never had a permanent space. And this is a current project, which is called the Museum on Wheels. It's still in beta testing almost. But as you can see, it's a large vehicle. and they've tried to make it wheelchair accessible as well. And over here is this indoor exhibition, and over here is actually a soundproof room that's been constructed right at the back so that oral histories can be. So the idea is that this vehicle moves around and it's going. It's focusing on Sindh right now, small areas in Sindh. And the idea is that the children come, they go through this exhibition, and then they bring their grandparents and parents, and they are able to, if they want, record their oral histories in the little booth on this side. So these are the kinds of projects that happen with the archival content that is collected and curated, and that goes through various levels of design and editing. But the sort of major exhibition that the major project that is, I won't call it major, all are important, but the most permanent project that I worked on with this organization it's called the National History Museum, and it's based in Lahore. And this becomes a different project in many ways. But one thing I have to say about all these projects, and specifically the museum project that we're going to focus on, is that although I'm not an archivist and I'm not an oral historian. Our oral history team it's called the Oral History Project. Although I've taken a few interviews because I really had to, it's not. My colleagues are excellent at it. They really know how to gain one's trust and to develop that level of comfort and trust, especially when the interviewees are sharing such painful memories and their memories are being jogged. So while I do not take most of these interviews myself, it's very important, and always has been for myself, as well as any member of the design team, to be part of these interviews, to go often, even if you have a huge deadline up, even if something is meant to open the next day, you still have to make sure you go for those interviews. And we've realized it's really important so that you don't remove yourself. You don't forget that this is not just a creative brief for you to design, that these are stories of real people, these are real memories. You need to go to experience physically what it's like to be in front of these people, to physically be in their presence is a very different experience. I do think that audio and video are very powerful, but when you are in their physical presence, it does make a really big difference. And it helps you not to dehumanize any of the stories, especially when you spend so much time in the design studio. You remember that interaction, and that, I think, really helps us stay true to remembering that these are people and these are real stories. So yeah, so that's one sort of point, and really important thing that we really try to do, that we try to maintain that physical connection as well with as many people as is possible with timelines. We're a very small team, so the timelines are always very rushed. So so a little bit about this museum project. So this is a project between a nonprofit, that is the Citizens Archive, and the PHA, which is the Parks and Horticultural Authority in Lahore. So it started in about 2016. The government of Punjab was redoing this major park, and they had already, at this point, built a building that they thought should be a museum, a very sort of modern building. They had begun their plans before they approached us to come and join in. The site of the museum is quite important because the park is called the Great Iqbal Park, and the museum itself, it's a stone's throw away from the Minar-e-Pakistan, which is a very important national monument. And the space itself, the site of both the museum and the monument, is of great historical significance in Pakistan's history. It's the site where the the All India Muslim League passed the revolution, the resolution on 23rd March, demanding a separate homeland. So it's the park is huge, and it's also very important historically. And then even before that, it was always an important site because it also is the park that you have the Badshai Mosque, and you have the Lahore Fort, sort of all around this space. So the site has always been important, and it's always garnered a huge crowd, just to sit in the park and Lahore also has a big park culture, and it's a lovely park. So this park, especially on public holidays, it's always full, and it's very very accessible as well. And I speak of this because accessibility and the amount of people that are going to come to a specific place is also very very important when you're thinking about just power dynamics and planning for the space. So, so there are a lot of aspirations um, for this museum, and I feel that there often are in museum makings in the site of a museum, but especially when it has the title of, and the government had already pre-decided that this would be called the National History Museum. So there's already a lot of hopes and dreams that go into a space like this, of all of its stakeholders. And I think that's also something that really one needs to be conscious of, very conscious and aware of when working with any like state or non-state actors or institutions. Um, so so several objectives were there from the government, and then also that we had to consider. Their objectives were, again, most of them were extremely positive, extremely hopeful, nation building, education. They really wanted a space to celebrate the national history. And But this is just the beginning. What then happens is when you bring in design such as where the major stakeholders would like the sort of examples or influences that they're bringing in. Say, one example that one gentleman wanted it to look like Versailles. Now, obviously, that's not really going to happen. But there are several people who come in with the influences, and curators as well, the designers as well. We're all bringing in our different influences into the design, into the display, into the interactive elements. All of these things become extremely important. Timeline is something that's really important. Where do you start your history? So obviously, we can start the history wherever, but this specific history, it was decided by the government to start from the East India Company. So that does question how you tell the story when you start in this way, and it does say a lot about your relationship with colonialism and post-colonialism beyond that. Disruption is very important. So one of the reasons why I was drawn to oral histories and working with them and working with the archive in the first place because I really believe that oral histories and they have this power to break and disrupt the mainstream narrative. The more voices that you have from different places, the more languages that you have, the more sides to a story you have, the more you end up fracturing what sometimes very dangerously becomes that singular historical narrative. However, we have to keep in mind that even though you're disrupting the narrative, you are still, as an oral historian, um, you may not be writing the questions, but you are asking the questions. You are creating an environment in which these questions are being asked and so answered. And once you collect these oral histories, uh, I mean, there's some conversations that end up being 3 sessions. So those are 3 to 4 hours long. We're never going to share the whole story. It's going to go through edits. It's going to go through several edits to fit through a narrative that is constructed by the curatorial team within the space. So those bits are bits of the story. They're never the entire story. There's never enough space for the entire story. But even as an audience or listener, in most cases, you will not have the capacity or the patience to listen to a 3 to 4 hour story. So it's always a part of the story. And through editing and the way it's placed within the larger design, it is highly curated. So you are bringing so much of yourself, of your experience. Just a lot more is coming in than just that story. So this is also something to be very aware of, that there are these there's multiple levels of editing and curation, starting with when the oral history is collected, when the person is interviewed to begin with. Language is another big thing. So, for example, majority of our team, uh, majority of the team that is doing the research and design, majority of the books, although a lot of Urdu and Punjabi books are looked at, majority is in English. And then the museum, this museum itself, it's in English and Urdu. It's bilingual, but it starts in Urdu. So you start from the right, you enter from the right because of the Urdu script, and that's how you move um, around the museum. But again, you're in Lahore, in Punjab. So it feels it. The decision was made to make it in English and Urdu, but uh, you are obviously denying accessibility in many ways by not having it in Punjabi or other languages. And then a lot of things get lost in translation as well. So one small example is parts of this museum narrative is first written in English, and then it's translated in Urdu. Now, obviously, if it's first written in Urdu and then translated in English, it would be different, because just merely because of the translation. Now, obviously, many historians and translators and writers and a few scholars were brought in to discuss all of this. So there are multiple people who are brought in, so that it's not so that there's less power of just this archive or just the government, so that there are more cooks to spoil the broth. That's the idea. But it's never this neutral space. It cannot be. And I think that is what one thing that you sort of you accept that this is not a neutral space. And I think that acceptance is important, because then you are aware of the power that you possess in creating this narrative. And then representation is, and this I'll actually come back to. I want to point out one more example about international organizations and museums. Many we've not actually been to, but we've, through the internet, through their talks, through their books, we've looked at a lot of case studies of how essentially how different stories are told. And one wonderful example, if you are, which has a lot of resources online, if you're looking to study, is the Poland Museum in Warsaw. I was listening to one of their talks online about curating memory and dealing with the past within the museum space. And this was a very there was a part of this talk by the chief curator, which in which she spoke about how one constructs a narrative and then takes it forward. And one thing, because archives will, I think, forever have issues with funding. One very positive thing was that in waiting so long for their funding to come for their museum, they had a very long time to think and work through with so many different scholars and people, and so they had a set to guide them as to what they expected of their narrative, what they wanted their narrative to contain, and thinking really about the site, because the site of the museum is a former ghetto in Warsaw, and so it's the site itself is very important. And so this has been one museum which has dealt very well with archives in terms of dealing with a lot of difficult subjects and creating this zone of trust, which is what the oral historians here have also had to create. Um, with a lot of the interviewees. And I've put the link here, Ishita. You can share it onward with anyone you want. There's a few other good, helpful talks in these series as well. And then there's one more thing that she pointed out, which we experienced very much as well, because what happens is that so we do not have, as an archive or as a museum, any precious objects. We do not have precious documents because we do not have, this space does not have the temperature control or the requirements, or the things that are required to take care of such precious objects. So everything we have is digitized. We have voice, we have audio, we have video, and then we have a lot of things, and we have a lot of stories, so that whatever we construct, and this can be extremely limiting, but in our case it has been extremely liberating, that when you don't have actual objects, you can but you have to also put curbs on your imagination. You have to stay true to the story. But what we did in the case of, for instance, we ask one question that's very often asked is, what did you carry back with you? What did you carry with you when you came to Pakistan? And this varies from where the person migrated from, the class they belong to, the socioeconomic position, their journey, the date, the time. There's so many variables. So some people came without even the shoes on their feet, and some people brought back a few objects that then became family heirlooms, which we wouldn't want to keep in any rate. And then some people came with nothing, but they have memories of what they could have carried. Some of them, there's one story about a grandfather's pipe, one family photograph, a set of binoculars. So in this case, what we did is that the installation contains fabricated objects, and we made animations of based on the stories, because I mean, they remember, all the details are very clearly there. So those excerpts of their journeys and what they carried, in one space of the museum, we've turned into multiple animations of what the journey was like and what they carried with them. In another case where we just had the memories to work with, we worked with a company called Vanilla Arcade. And again, this was working with, and this was very, I mean, this, oh my, everyone cried so much, because this is very difficult. The animated form does not allow for things to necessarily always become humorous. These were very painful stories that were turned into then a animated virtual reality experience. So within the structure of a train that came from Amritsar to Lahore, uh, a virtual reality experience was created in which people got to see a story, got to witness a story, again recreated, of that journey, trying to mimic the emotions, the sounds. Uh, and obviously, this was a few stories merged, but this is again one way um, that we didn't have actual footage of a personal experience, so we used visual tools to capture and describe that experience. But again, it's very important to actually go and sit with that person and listen, um, as opposed to just deal with that audio and turn it into something visual and digital, because you have to, I mean, these are very, very painful stories on both sides of the border. So they have to be dealt with a lot of trust, and a lot of care. um, I'm just checking the time. Okay. I'm good. So what else can I share with you? um Overwhelmingly, the experience is one in which, and I keep repeating this sort of thing of being conscious and being cognizant of who you're working with and who your stakeholders are and what their desires are, because you end up having a lot of power in these spaces. So I spoke about the site, I spoke about how it is very easily accessible, how sometimes on the weekends there are over 25,000 people in that park. Now, that doesn't mean that 25,000 people are going to come into this museum, but that does mean that there is always a crowd there. So a lot of them are likely to come in. And so another thing with, and a lot of them may not be literate. So again, when you're giving, and if you've designed something that, I mean, we're very proud of how beautifully our design team has created this space. But when you give such a beautifully packaged design, and you give, you know, drama, you give audio, you give video, you're really packaging this well and selling a story. So you have to be conscious of the power that you have in telling the story. Because the more grappling the visuals are, the more compelling the visuals are, the more likely you are to engage someone. And so there's a lot of responsibility to sort of make sure that it is, you're not, and you can't tell everyone's story. Obviously, every story that you tell, you are excluding um, multiple stories. So it's very so for us it was very important to collect as many different narratives, if compared to like socioeconomic class and where people were from, and getting as many stories as possible. But still, it was just for me, it's always, um, I just have this huge sense of responsibility of, I've already received limited knowledge from state issued textbooks on our history. And so, can you ever make it right? Probably not. But when you create such an experience about this journey, it's very important to make people think that this is not it, to use language in a way that is that makes one think that there is another whole other side to the story. So that's been one thing that's of huge pressure. Um, okay, I just need 1 minute. I've lost where I was supposed to be. Um, since I brought up language, I want to bring up one more example about how much power there can be in creating visual experiences. One thing is, when you make anything cater to children, the language, everything is sort of, the visuals, everything is sort of dumbed down, right? To simplify, to for a child to be able to engage. Things are censored in some cases, meaning in the museum there are spaces where which are more violent. So obviously there's a warning there for parents who might not want to take their children there. But then there is this children's space which is beautifully made in collaboration with an educational organization. And this is sort of a happy space. So one thing to be aware of is you're really, really dumbing things down for children, obviously. So simplifying things when curating and designing and presenting um, can be dangerous. And then the other thing is that it is so easy to literally rewrite history. So, for example, there's one chapter of the history which is called the Gandhi Jinnah talks. There was one particular gentleman who was like, this is a museum in Pakistan. We should call it Jinnah Gandhi Talks. We should put Jinnah before Gandhi, just because we're in Pakistan. And there was this whole debate about it, and you think like, how are we contesting this? Like, why is this even something that's being discussed? At the end of the day, we didn't change it, but it's very easy. I felt in these experiences, and literally with one name turned around, you can rewrite history in such a permanent sort of way in a space, and it can reach so many people. So language and how things are written and presented is also something that has a huge impact, and that really yeah, that we really need to be very, very careful and very mindful of. On the other hand, the fine print has also has also been a very powerful tool in the past. So, for instance, I showed a photograph from 2011 of an exhibition that took place in Karachi and Lahore, and it was a timeline of Pakistan from 47 to 71. So it did cover the liberation war and the birth of Bangladesh. But yeah, it was able to be there because of the presentation of the language and the design within that specific context. Um, there are a few other things, and I'm just talking about histories that don't make it or stories that don't make it. I keep coming back to this because this is something of great interest to me in everything I do. So, and this brings us to the question of representation: who is represented and who is left out. And you have to be mindful of many things. So, for example, a lot of active female leaders chose not to have themselves chose not to have their faces photographed. So they're very politically active. They contributed largely to many government and non-government positions and movements. But I mean, they were not. Um, they chose to not ever show their face. And so in these cases, and in one of there was a desire again to have this this hall of heroes, and this was supposed to be a very grand European style sort of hall of heroes, and it's not very relevant in the picture. But if you look very carefully, you can see these images here. So there was supposed to be a list from every province commemorating all of the Pakistani heroes. Okay, and this becomes again very complicated because the larger sort of burning question is what makes a hero. So is a hero what about separatist movements? What about so again, the women who covered themselves, they were featured in this gallery, but they were in their abaya. There's no this is the only this is how you have to respect how they would like to be presented. They didn't want to show their faces. So this is how they are presented. And then there are a lot of people who don't make it to that list of heroes because they were never interested in the idea of Pakistan. So they might be heroes and saviors to a huge group of people in a specific region in present day Pakistan, but they didn't really make the cut. So these sorts of decisions are. I mean, I would say this is maybe where we were like. As an archive or as curatorially, we were sort of least involved, and there were many people giving their suggestions, and the list kept growing and growing. But again, this is just bringing me back to the question of how loaded a space a national museum can be, and the pressure that comes with working within a space with this when they have this sort of requirement that has come from, I guess, well, I'm not sure where, but I guess it's just wherever it's come from, this idea of we need to commemorate our heroes. Um, I think I'm going to share one more example, and then maybe I will take a break to think and see if I didn't cover something, and we can do some questions, and maybe I can come back to things. I'm not sure. But so one of the things, so I have one example that is not from really the curatorial world, that's more from the art world. And I'm a practicing artist, and I look at a lot of, I look to the art world for systems of critique that make a lot of sense in this museum world in some ways. There's an American artist called Fred Wilson, and um, he has made a lot of work about the way that histories are showcased within museum spaces, and the elimination of Africans from a lot of spaces of historical significance. And he has this quote, which is a bit cynical, of course, but it is a food for thought for someone like me. And he had this project in which, actually, I'll show you the photo first. So if you are not, so if you see this, you have a you think of a specific kind of space. You think of, okay, maybe this is Turkish, maybe this is Arabic. Unless you're fluent in Arabic, you're not really going to read this for what it is. But he puts his sort of, everything he makes, it has a huge historical reference, and then it's a little bit off. So this is this mosaic is, it's actually, it's supposed to be uh, it's supposed to be black, like it's not supposed to be blue, and it says black is beautiful and Mother Africa, and if you see it from far, you're just going to sort of assume it's something Islamic. And the same goes with a lot of his portraits. He inserts these figures in that was sort of painted out when the histories of African slavery were told in Europe. People were literally painted out of portraits, and these portraits have been carried on. And so this one quote he has is, I'm interested in the museum because it's a space where no one expects to be misled. Whatever they give you, you believe. And this again is something that reminds me of people are not expecting to be misled. Is this idea that it is that books, that museums, that these spaces of education, that they will only give you the truth. Um, and so it's just, I think, another testament to the amount of power that there is, as we have as educators, as curators, as people who work with truths. But what can happen um, in these spaces, and the expectations that people have when they go into these spaces. So how careful and how responsible we have to be in these spaces. Okay.
Sophia, this was quite. I mean, for me at least, not that I didn't know, but I think hearing it again and the way you put it was overwhelming suddenly. That yes, you sort of are in a space of power, a position of power, and do you accept it is the first question, because I have seen in some of the projects personally, I've struggled to own it up, or not own it up in the space, own it up in action, yes, in activities, yes, but uh, taking a stand or allowing for one truth to be told, because eventually that has to happen, as you rightly pointed out. Whether you like it or not, people want to be sort of guided and told what's happening in a space. So the struggle between being an archivist and then sometimes having to curate projects, I've seen that struggle. So you just put it out there, that when you transition from one role to the other, the kind of power that you own, and then you need to hone it as well, I think is incredible. And especially when you're working with political histories, the kind of histories that I think you have worked with, it must have been a very sensitive experience as well, if I might say so.
Yeah. It's, I think when I was listening to the lectures that you sent me, actually, there was something that Amandeep Sandhu said that was that I mean, the topic, his topic was great, but also he said that and I'm paraphrasing him, but he said that there is no such thing as non-fiction, because everything is nothing is objective, and reality is mediated through you and through your culture and the way you think through it. So and he's thinking of this through being a writer, but also just through reading and experiencing his research. So I thought it's true, it's very true, dealing with these political histories, but it is also just dealing with any of the stories that we sort of collect. I think it is important to acknowledge, especially in the space that I worked in, but in any space really, that can you treat this everything as non-fiction, as he's saying. I thought that was something very interesting he said, and it just I was really thinking about it when thinking about the space and how to talk about it. So anything that you any oral history or any archival content, well, there is fact and there is proof, but I mean, I found it very encouraging how he said to think of it as a reality that's mediated almost through your experience.
Yeah. And I think that is where I think the whole creative practice sort of seeps in for me. And even listening to you, it felt like, that is where the presentation would have gone. That this is the role of the curator, and these are the rather the roles and responsibilities of the curator. So what happens when it translates to the designer? When it moves on? I understand that these are not very black and white boundaries, but I'm just trying to draw them to sort of try and see if our response or realization changes. That here, as a curator, you're building this space for us to understand the power we sort of bear and then hone. Um, but is there then a sort of a letting go or a loss of power also, that now when you hand it over to the design team, when they are going to visualize?
I I think the way we work though is that I'm still fairly design involved in the design process. So the conversation is ongoing, and they are involved in the research and collection process because they are coming for the interviews, and the conversation is ongoing. And then we bring in the research team and the oral historians again, and we look at what's been designed, and we have to have that conversation. Okay, is this almost becoming non-serious? Is this a subject matter, like if you're working with an animation, is this something that is very serious, that is almost because of the animated form becoming comical or less serious? Or is this aesthetically, does this require less design, more almost sobriety from our end? Sometimes design can do remarkable things that sometimes art and design does these things that the written or spoken work cannot visually. It has the power to do that. And then sometimes even the designers sort of back off, and we're like, and this is when there's very something very upsetting or moving, and it's just like, you know what, this needs to be a quiet space, we need to honor this story. We need to just put the design on the side, and let's just listen to the voice of this person, let's just hear their story, and set design aside. So there's a there's a constant conversation, and I think it's like working through these things for so long with this hope with hopefully the same group of people is great. And then we have a lot of advisors, a lot of artists that are sometimes artists are brought on for collaborations to get that fresh perspective that we are stuck in this space and we can't get out of. So yeah, I think it's a really really deep process, but there is a lot of conversation and back and forth throughout. And I think we don't stop the back and forth till everyone is sort of feeling that a story or a moment has been done justice to.
And at what point does, because quite a few of your examples did hint at involvement of bureaucratic people,
Mm-hmm.
decision makers. So at what point does the conversation sort of get influenced, affected by them, and how is it dealt with? Because here now, let's say the team has arrived at, this is the emotion we want to capture, this is how we want to tell it. And then I'm just imagining the most filmy scenario where now comes in a sahab with his lathi saying, no, you cannot say this. So do you completely give up? Is there a fight, or is there the other way around? Playing safe where you already keep them in loop beforehand, decide what is to be said. So I'm just trying to understand, where does the freedom stop? Just
Mm-hmm.
very honest. Yeah.
So we kept them in the loop. There were a few things that were helpful because there was never too much resistance.
Oh.
Okay, so keeping involved from the start was important. There was a lot of trust that was given to us. We did share our stories. We did share the kind of work we've done. We were very honest about, not making another monument for just glorification. We shared oral histories. We shared, a lot of the stories which were not very just not just the simple stories, the stories that were more bitter. There was more difficult content. We didn't shy away from sharing that in the beginning because we knew what we were getting into, and this was not a project to just please the government. We have much more responsibility to that than that. So either we try and do it justice, or we don't do it. They have many other of these national monuments and places where I mean, this kind of storytelling is not present. So we were very realistic and honest from the start. And then, of course, there are, and they were very involved. So there were a lot of conversations that continue to happen back and forth. And yes, there always is this sort of thinking, okay, but we must not make our nation ever look bad. But there are things like this is where language comes in, because you have to put in that thing that there was violence committed by all sides on both sides of the border. Putting in things like this is very, very important. And they read it, they read the translations, they know it's going there. And these are sort of things that we said, look, we cannot compromise on these things. You know then the other thing is, there are so many oral histories in the museum that I don't know if they've heard each and every one of them, because that's ours and ours and ours. So, meaning we're not lying about anything, but there's just sometimes you don't get to something unless you listen to the whole thing. You know what I mean? So, it's possible we got away with putting in a few things. But then, apart from that, I brought this up. Okay, we just try to disrupt the narrative as much as possible. So, just bringing in more and more people from different communities, bringing in more and more. Voices from more and more female voices, more and more experiences, and little things like there are people on the front lines. There are people who you read about and stuff, but what about the experience of a woman who never left her home? What about the little details like how much something cost, or what she heard on the radio? And there's a lot of these things that also come in then, that you're able to further, like, just build this story and just fracture it as much as possible. So I don't know, maybe at some points they didn't listen to everything. I spoke to you about the 1971 exhibition and how there was stuff there which it was in fine print, or it was design wise done in a way that if you didn't look, you didn't see it. Um, with this museum space, we didn't reach 71. Otherwise, I don't know if we would have been allowed to do that. But we stopped at 1960, meaning there was also, you could call it, I guess, maybe an element of self censorship, where we got to focus on a lot of good times. And then there was a whole room on sports. There was a whole room on Lollywood. And so again, when you're talking about film and you're talking about media, it's impossible not to bring in Bangladesh or the East Pakistani history, right? So we did bring them in because they were such a huge part of the entertainment industry. I mean, it was primarily there. It was, you can't leave that out. So in those spaces, even though we had passed that timeline, we did have to bring in that, then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, this was happening. So, I mean, we took it on ourselves to bring in wherever, trying to think where there was really any resistance. Um, it was actually not, I think because we stopped at 1960, we got away with not speaking about the 65 war, about 71. Um, yeah, and we didn't really speak much about like the skirmishes in the middle. The violent parts that were spoken about was clearly acknowledged that it was not a one-sided thing, and atrocities took place on both sides. So, I mean, that there was no denying that, nor did the government try to deny that. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I think I get a sense of for sure the question I asked, and I'll just have one more question before we move on to the participants and the audience. Is also so the one was to understand censorship, as you rightly said, from the other side, if it had an implication on the way you thought, but also from now within the team? Because I think you used certain words which are quite provoking, which is fabrication of the objects or the whole idea of packaging the experience. And I'm right now seeing them very critically because so for me, it usually happens that the archivist sort of stays on top and the designer is usually the next. How much should we be fabricating and how much should we be packaging? And in that, when we sense a compromise or a loss of information, do you sort of see yourself taking a step back, or is the whole idea of engagement and the whole experience building and the performance of it so important that sometimes the story is allowed to be simplified, oversimplified?
It's a very possible and very dangerous thing. Also, it's when you have such talented, such good designers, it's possible to make something so compelling design wise that the story is not at the forefront anymore because you are just immersed in the design. So that has happened. And it, and I think because it's like we're working in such a small space and everyone is in everyone's face and there's so much back and forth with this small team, that the researchers and the world historians are constantly there. At the end of the day, the curator does make the decision, but I do listen and I have to listen. It's my responsibility to listen to the team, to go back and listen to some of the stories without all the noise of design, to be able to mediate that space. And then we bring in a lot of people to do the sort of experience testing. So apart from the board members, just going back and sharing it with our grandparents, our parents, people we know, students coming in. There's a lot of testing and back and forth that takes place to make sure that the story is not compromised. And as I mentioned, in some cases, we got rid of the design and we made it a more quiet space where you could just hear the story and just focus on that voice without anything else. At the same time, I mean, you are building this um, to engage people. You want them to listen, you want to draw them in, you want them to engage with these stories, with these histories, you want them to listen. You also want them to read, because sometimes listening is not enough. You need everything. You need to draw them in and keep them as much as you can. And you definitely don't want to bore people, especially if these people were bored in history lessons or in school, or they're not even bored but they never got that information, and there is so much truth in what you're saying. You want to share that. And there are multiple instances where, like, I mean, we also learned through this project, through just oral histories, that, oh, I didn't know this. So so engagement is very, very important at every level. I mean, especially for the younger generation. So there is a kids section for younger kids where it's more focused on, explore your country, explore the music. This is what a post office look like, this is what a this look like. But then when you're at an age where you can take in a little bit more, it's I think it is really important to engage them. And design, definitely good design, engaging design, interactive spaces, it definitely helps do that. Nobody wants to walk into a space with text on the walls, and simple headphones. We create things that you can pull out, you can touch, you can feel. There's digital games, there's constantly we're grappling with, okay, how is this, when you turn into this space, how is this, is it the same, is it getting monotonous, does it need a different feel? Obviously, is it doing justice to the story, is it honoring that person and that story? But at the same time, is it engaging? And we are spending so many hours and days and weeks on design. Like, we ourselves need to not get bored of it. So that these designers spend so long on their screen, so they themselves also have this, like, this is it, like, no, we are changing it, we are not using this scheme anymore, we really need to change it up. And then decisions change when, obviously, we've designed everything, like, we've made, we've constructed these fake walls. So we've been working on this primarily in Karachi. So everything has been done on, like, fake walls. We've gone on some site visits, but obviously when you go there and you install, And in Karachi, you're working with this little model and these fake walls, and you go in this space, everything changes. So then even once you go to that space, you might have designed everything perfectly in your head, conceptually, through your test, through, all everything you thought you had figured it out. But when you're actually in that space, it's a very different experience. So a lot of changes also come in, unfortunately for all of us and the designers. A lot of changes come in when you are actually in that physical space and going through it. And sometimes things work great when on your screen on the test thing, but it all changes in the space. The story is lost, or the design is lost, or it's just intuitively you all know, okay, this is not what we had in mind. But throughout, communication is key, because you need, I mean, they're just, we have to work so long
Hmm.
on so much that just constantly the communication of the team has to be there.
Right. Thanks. I mean, these are some very, very insightful responses. I'm going to request Johan to pick up his question because it really connects to the kind of last two questions I had. Johan, if you would like to unmute yourself and read them out yourself.
So hi again. Thank you for the presentation, because it felt like you were speaking to us working at Historical Dialogue, because we're also working on similar kind of a museum as well. So it was, yeah, very insightful. I just wanted to talk to you, or ask whether you could speak a bit more. I know Ishita also asked this about the design element, maybe transforming into the accessible forms in the museum. I noticed there were objects, photographs, and also miniatures. So maybe you already touched on that a bit, but if you could maybe say something else. But also, maybe my next question is also on the dialogues that happen within the museum. I'm sure you would have seen a lot of questions being asked, a lot of uh, uh, interactions between the participants themselves. How were some of those captured, and how do they feed into the whole museum experience of future visitors as well?
Are you talking about the audience interacting and those
Yes,
conversations? Okay.
yes.
So design wise, you said uh, so yeah, so to speak a little more to design, are you talking more about the process, or the sort of final way that things come together, just so that I could
Yeah.
answer a little more specifically
I think you
to your.
did speak about the process when Ishita asked about and also you also said that the designers were part of the interviews, were very much an integral part. They didn't come like a second tier, which usually happens. So then maybe the second layer of how did you decide that it is this format suits well for these kind of memories, and maybe just briefly. I know it's a very subjective
Okay.
process. Yeah.
So no, this is a great question. So I guess first of all, we've had a lot of practice with smaller projects. I focused mainly on this museum space, but I would say since 2009, there's just constantly been, on a small scale, on a big scale, with like zero budget, meaning like, no, when I joined, I was a volunteer. I wasn't even paid to work on the project. So and we were using a lot of recycled things. So we just initially we just wanted to get in a space and be able to share what we had collected. So initially, when you start with nothing, you I mean, I guess the focus of the hero was always the oral histories and stories, and then the archival photos. Those were always the hero, right? Especially without the budget. I mean, you have to pay designers as well, right? So when you have one graphic designer and one volunteer curator, you have to be very practical about what you're going to make. But we've always had a lot of creative volunteers, students, all of that. I'm very grateful for that. But the hero always had to be the archival photos and the oral histories. So a lot of the design was always spending time initially, just with those photos and with just listening, meditating, spending time with those stories. Then a lot of I guess the like textures are really important. So the things that you collect already have a lot of texture, meaning those photographs now, but they are digital, right? So the physical textures we worked with are of importance. So for example, a old colonial building, the texture of that wall versus a gallery space, which might make it very flat. So, working within the site itself was always something that informed the design, depending on, because these were always short, temporary, projects in the beginning. Okay, so we were constantly trained to move within different spaces and different contexts. Sometimes there's no bijli, sometimes like there's just a itna sa, like the can station was literally a small box. Okay, so we started with working with just very small compact spaces, but what we found a lot out of I guess experimentation and trial and error was that people are very easily bored. So you have to give them more than just text and language. I mean, we want to share all of this, but you have to give them more in text than language. So that was one thing. Then the other thing is that electricity is always a problem, especially if we were working in like the more public spaces. I mean, for sure, half the day there would be no bijli, right? And there's also like a lot of manpower involved in going, checking, turning it on, turning it off. If you focus just on audio in a lot of spaces, um, it's not going to work. So we had to learn how to always have some text, some visuals, and then the Bijli ka masla again, we had to figure out systems that worked. So little things working on batteries. In the first example that I showed you, which was a mobile museum with the shade, that little box outside Frere Hall, that barely had that. Literally, the only thing that was functioning in it that needed electricity was the oral histories coming out of a built-in speaker. And for that project, we got a very small solar power generator, meaning it was run by solar power. And these were all in places that they were very sunny places. We had no issue with sun ever in especially Karachi or Lahore most times of the year, and these are where they were. So we used solar power for those, and we were able to reuse those panels for wherever they moved, and they lasted. But we've always had to build things in a compact way because things always get stolen as well. We want to put our things out there, but when things go missing, I mean, there's no point when there's a puzzle that goes away, or like a speaker that goes away, or a screen that's missing. um, so then in a lot of the spaces, rather than having a flat image, you think, okay, what can I do? Why don't I turn this flat image into a puzzle? And it's a puzzle built into the wall, so that you have to there's something to do, but there's not a screen that someone can break and take away. So I think just a lot of like just experiences of things not working out, things getting taken away, um, and sun fading, printing, like whatever we use, anything that's in the sun. Sure, you can use solar power, but then the printing fades. So working with a lot of materials that end up being practical and very long lasting. So first figuring out those practicalities, and then after that, focusing a lot on, okay, what looks good. But more important than that, we had to make sure that no one was walking away with everything, or something wasn't fading, or these sorts of things. And that, how do you bring or like how do you get people to, I mean, video though came a little later, but audio, how do you even let these audio devices, these expensive headphones, are not practical anymore in a public space? I mean, it's just not, for several reasons. So how can you work around this to make sure you're still engaging with your audience without losing, I mean, half of your very expensive, mal because we've always had limits and very small budgets. And then, so then when, after years of doing this kind of jugaad, when we finally got this space which is contained, which someone was that we were actually being paid for finally. The designers went wild. I mean, for years, all of us have been collecting these ideas. We've all, like, wherever we went, we were physically or online researching museums. Like every person part of this project is a bit mad and has always wanted to, like, you really want to be part of this, you're and a lot of them have been around for a while. A lot of them, I myself, I was there, I left for my master's, I came back. We've always, like, the goal was always sort of to have a space of our own at the end. So for years, all of us have our sketchbooks and our, files and everything of like years of these ideas and stuff. So finally, when we got paid for it and we had electricity and there was no sun coming in the building to make the design walls fade. I mean, it was just, it was really a matter of then finally, like when you do this, okay, editing, you can't put everything in, So that was actually like, we'd been waiting for this for so long. I'm not sure if I even answered your question.
Yeah, I think you did answer. The second part was on the dialogue, that the rich dialogue that would have happened,
Yeah.
or were there volunteers that maybe could guided people in this the truck kind of thing, and did they also feedback to you saying these are the questions they asked, or these are the issues they had, or these are the kind of conversations that were happening? Because that is important
So
to you as well, no? As a curator, to see how people are engaging with the material.
So, I mean, we have feedback forms which are not the most effective, to be honest. You're right in that you have to physically be there to witness the interactions and the way people behave and interact in this space. Unfortunately, because I'm based in Karachi, I could not be there. Like, I was there a lot when we were building it, but when actually it came together and it was done, then I couldn't afford to spend so much time there anymore. There was no reason for them. So I have limited interaction myself personally with those crowds of people. So a lot of the feedback I have is through the tour guides, because there are tour guides in every room. Let me think. The interaction has been the one of the things that we were worried about, for instance, is this virtual reality like train experience, right? We wanted to not. I mean, we didn't want anything to become less serious than it was. We're not doing it, John K, to be a tearjerker or to get people emotional. But I mean, these are very, very emotional, very painful memories and stories. So we have, I mean, the idea is that we do justice to that, and we worked very, very long on making sure that the feel was historically accurate, but also, I mean, it was true to the emotions of the storytellers. So I mean, obviously, like, younger generations went on that train journey and they found it extremely emotional, extremely provocative, and everyone was in tears most of the time, sort of a thing. But then we actually had people who took that train journey come on it, which was a huge privilege, a very important experience for us. And we wanted them to experience it, and we wanted to talk to them about it after. If we had shown this video again on a screen to two people who'd made that journey, and they felt comfortable, they had given some feedback which we incorporated, but they said this feels like a depiction of, yes, what could have been a journey. But obviously, when you're in that physical space, when you go into that train carriage from then, and you have this on, and the speakers and everything, it's different from when we visited people and made them do it. And then that experience, I mean, the feedback was very good. The people were very upset and emotional, but I mean, the feedback we got was that, and we're not trying to hit the nail on this either, right? Like, that's not the point of this. We don't want to misconstrue the story or the emotion, but the emotion and story, the feedback from the migrants, the who actually made that journey, their feedback was very good. And that was one of the very important parts for us, that with all of this technology and VR and everything, we don't want to misconstrue, we don't want to over dramatize, we don't want to oversimplify, and we want that emotion and story to be there. So that, I think, we were very happy that it was successful. The other feedback was, I think, obviously, like, parts of the history are just really painful and really dark. So I think when we got to the lighter subjects like sports and sports and the kids section and music and media,
Exactly.
there was some relief which they needed. I mean, I guess everyone is only human, so, and there is drama. I mean, we've tried not to over dramatize, but these are extremely real, painful things that people have gone through. And with the human voice that, that just creates a space, that mixed with good design, it just, you're immersed in this world. So the other feedback we got was, I guess, that, okay, we're glad we have some positivity, because there are a lot of parts that are not positive, and we've not tried to make them positive. We've tried to stick true to the stories. And then other feedback, of course, was, so many languages in Pakistan. We knew we'd get that. So that's why a lot of the guides are also, we've tried to find people who speak multiple languages. Obviously, all the guides have to speak Punjabi, and then some speak Seraiki, and then there are other languages that some of them know. So that was a big part of it. Um, I'm trying to think. Um, yeah, I
Yeah, that does answer
okay.
the question. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. I think going into detail in those two questions was quite helpful, because these are very real, practical things as well. I think in terms of how you dealt with situations, which we got to know. So I'm going to jump the sequence quite a bit, because Vishwesh also has a question which connects to. So Vishwesh, if you could
Yeah.
unmute and add
Yeah.
to this. Yeah.
So my question was really about this. You're working with very, very small spaces, but you do have a lot of material with you from what you said. So my question was really, what is the sort of criteria you set for the selection of the narrative you want to sort of put forward, because you have many themes to choose from, and two, the specific materials that would sort of communicate that narrative.
And by materials, you mean?
It could be the stories, the audio, oral histories you want to sort of tell, the photographs you want to use, the editing of the oral history itself, from the perspective of the theme also.
Okay, so one thing I have to say, which may not be, which is a bit, I guess, maybe cynical and not motivating, but this is the reality. For a long time, we had to run on grants, okay, and a lot of the grants come with their conditions. So, for instance, if there is a grant from a certain place that is focusing on, I mean, I hate this term, but I mean, it's the truth, countering violent extremism. Okay? So that was a narrative. And I mean, this is something that being in Karachi, like, you don't mind doing, but this, and it's just an example of one of the sort of markers or conditions of one of the grants we had to work on. Some of the other grants were focused more on women empowerment. Now, again, this was not something that was ever forced. From the beginning, one of the main aims of the founders and a lot of the curators, and there've always been a lot of strong women in this organization and space. The head of everything is a woman, in fact. Great. But the sharing the stories of women, or highlighting the stories of women throughout the history, which are not really heard, this has always been like something from the start. But this also is something that a lot of the grants have been interested in. So, I mean, unfortunately, but also fortunately, because we did make the most out of some of these projects and produce good projects in these spaces, we had to follow some of the guidelines of the grants. And so, and so then the thematically the themes or projects that we then created out of them were based to satisfy some of these themes. That being said, there were other projects that we didn't have to do this for. What is your second question? I'm so
The
sorry.
second question was about, once you sort of got a basic theme, how do you sort of, what criteria or what is the process for selecting specific materials, editing, building the narrative, for all that?
So that actually we owe a lot to. So when we have a theme, then there are two types of research that are done. There are finding new and specific nominees for oral histories. So, for instance, if we're working on the 1971 project, the aim was, okay, we have to reach out to people who were there at that time, for instance, right? So these are the new stories that we need to collect. In terms of archival content, this what this project looked like was reaching out to different libraries and archives around the world to see what they have, because we didn't have a lot available in Pakistan, at least through the newspapers, etc. On this topic. We didn't have access to those images. We didn't have access to those numbers. So reaching out to them, and then and then when we collect the oral histories, we put a number of tags on them that in the cataloging process, so that when you are going back to research for a specific project, you are able to look up specific themes. So as many themes as possible that the archiving team are able to add when they are transcribing and cataloging the interviews, even before they reach, even because obviously we have a backlog, but even before they reach the process of transcribing, as soon as the interview is done, the person who conducts the interview, in fact, does ask specific questions, but any other information that comes up in the interview, those themes are added and flagged, so that when you look up for them, whether we're looking up for it or whether a researcher is later looking up for it, you're able to find those themes with, I mean, it still takes very long, but it's easier to go. And then you go through that content, and then a lot of it is not relevant when you need it. And you are creating then you take out all of those interviews, you take out all that content, you have this huge pile, and then I guess you start going through it, and then you try to stitch together this story, which you hope is as inclusive as possible.
Thank you so much for answering that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think this insistence on cataloging being equally important at the curatorial stage, or the need of rightly done cataloging so that it facilitates better curation, couldn't be more emphasized, I guess. So, good time to move on to Zahra's question, because now it's very specifically about certain stories. So, Zahra, would you want to unmute and ask it yourself?
Sorry, I think someone in my house is like shouting on the phone right now. So apologies if you can hear the noise. But basically, Sophia, I wanted to ask regarding the setup of each of the smaller dissemination booths. One, for example, that was in the railroad. One, for example, that was outside Fair Hall. Were the stories highlighted in those dissemination booths focused upon the building or perhaps the infrastructure that it represented, or were they also quite general about partition? How did you then decide and choose how to visualize or present each of those kind of larger narrations?
Sure, Zara. So again, I'm going to stress again how important it is to have a very good cataloging and tagging system, because I feel like it just shaves off weeks and months of time searching. So each booth, the place it was, wherever it was spaced, those stories were specific to what had happened at that space. So, for example, at Frere Hall, there's an old image of Frere Hall when there was still this fountain there, and there was a statue of Queen Victoria that then went somewhere else, and then there were these two lions, and there was an old image of that, and then there was stories, the oral histories, were people talking about the multiple uses of Frere Hall. So what it was like in the 50s and then in the 60s, what they would, it's a space that has a huge significance in the city, and then its function has changed a lot over the years. It was shut down, then it was reopened, then it was repainted. So the stories were all very specific. Some were more general to that space, but for instance, it was built. The narratives are all post partition, right? So no one is really talking about it. No one was around when it was constructed or met the people who constructed it, right? The stories are more focused on their relationship with that space, their relationship with that structure. And then we try to bring in any major events that took place that impacted that event, that space. So for that for instance was a picture of was Frere Hall. Then Can Station had again images that we found, and again we had to what's very helpful is working with the people of those specific spaces. So both Can Station, Frere Hall, the zoo, we had one at the Karachi Zoo as well. Building relationships with the people, because a lot of the great oral histories is, for example, the very old zookeeper at the Karachi Zoo. He knew more about the zoo than anyone else. There were stories of, people's parents and grandparents going there early, how its name changed, what they remembered, but no one could remember it like him. Or Frere Hall, the images that we needed of Frere Hall, the very, very old images, were found in the library of Frere Hall after befriending and building a relationship with the caretaker of Frere Hall. So these relationships are same with Can Station. The images or the stories that we got, a lot of them were from the coolies that had been there for very long. Like obviously some of the stories are from other people, but a lot of these site specific projects, it's very important to build relationships with, and I guess work on hearing and sharing the stories of the people in those spaces. And especially with these spaces, another big benefit of that is that a lot of them are sites that require they're in, they're in old condition. They need to be taken care of. A lot of them are heritage sites. So also working with the community there, it, even though it's like we've put something very small, but there's still like a sense of ownership that's established when you create something that's honoring their story, that's honoring the space that they've given so much of their time to. And it just what we've seen is that it really helps build a sense of ownership and care within that space of the building. So that's something that we've been lucky to experience.
Great. So over to Mevish. Mevish, you have a couple of questions, whichever you would like to pick first or however you want to plan.
Hi, Sophia. I just had a couple of questions. I think you've answered most of them. Like, for instance, and you can just briefly answer me. I can just ask them one by one. What is your criteria for bringing in the stories from partition into your curation? You've spoken about nominees. So, is there any criteria that you handpick them, or just?
So the initial criteria was literally the age. Anyone and everyone who had a grandparent or a great grandparent of that age, that was the first criteria. Anyone of age, and when the project started, it was small. So literally, it was like, the resources were also limited to take the recorder to get to that place. So accessibility, all of these things had a big part of it. So before, it was, I guess, when it started, it was more this person who knows this person, and there was like this nomination system. Then we moved on to places like some old age homes, where again there was like a group of people, and we could interview all of them. And then after that age thing, we looked at a lot of I guess I can call them themes, to maybe simplify it. But so for example, one of the themes was diplomats, people who've worked in hospitals, my different minority communities, because this was something again that was very, very absent. um, Educators and people who've worked in educational institutes, I guess celebrities of sort, um, and then even Mavish, you're asking mainly about the oral history part of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So these were just some of the themes, and then it moved on after we managed all of the people of a certain age. We then went to people like in the military, people who had been part of like student politics, and then within the people who had migrated, who had spent time in a refugee camp, um, who has um, who has been in the press. Press was a big part of it. A lot of journalists, writers, people in the music industry. So the more interviews we took, and the more we even people who had who built businesses. So a lot of the people who came, then there was this whole group that was focused on the old I guess kapra markets, the places where the first pre-partition businesses were started from scratch, a lot of that. And then as we covered all of those bases, then we moved on to more current events that people could recall.
Mhm. My next question would be that did you face you did clear that up that you did not face much hindrance from the government or opposition because you were taking them in the loop. But did you actually find any hindrances from already established Pakistani historians on the said subjects? Which is
Yes, there was a lot of debate amongst them.
mm,
I guess the impression that a lot of them had of us was more and I mean, no one in our team is a historian. We work with historians, we bring on historians, and we constantly work with them. But, there is not a historian on our team. So, I mean, that's why we asked for a body of historians and scholars to vet everything, to advise us. Because I mean, we couldn't. There's only so much that we could do, and even after we did all of our work, we still needed their feedback, their advice. I mean, it's important. So I think within those dialogues, less between us and them, because we were more sort of eager to learn, and more between different, I guess, scholars. There were some debates, um, and whatever feedback they gave us was usually good, and we tried to incorporate. But there was no sort of and they sometimes they would give critique, or they would give suggestions, and a lot of the suggestions again were more like, um, there were recommendations of books. There were recommendations of, like, I remember once, like, we were talking to them about a museum in where was it? Yeah, a museum in Budapest that is again dealing with memory, trauma, archives in a very engaging, tactile way. And the suggestion was, okay, why are we looking so westward? Let's look more localized. Why aren't you looking at Singapore? Why aren't you looking at these other museums that deal with archives and memory as well? Don't only look west. So there was a lot of very good suggestions. There were a lot of very good book suggestions. A lot of their books we had already read, because I mean we were using these as for our research. And so yeah, I think in that end there was more, maybe the scholars had some sort of things with each other, but
mhm,
with us we needed as much help as possible. So we were trying to
mhm,
just take everything in and improve our
mhm.
work with their advice.
I'll just move on to my next question, and I don't want to take much of the time, Ishita. Sorry, but I have a couple of questions. Anyways, I'll just move on to this next one. Regarding children's spaces, you've spoken about that. Are there any pamphlets or worksheets or something as a memento, like a takeaway thing that kids could take with them, like as a piece of that story or that narrative that you built in the museum?
So we not so I mean, meaning there's a gift shop which
Mhm,
has some stuff, but there's nothing. Like, we've come up with a lot of educational resources that I guess are used in, like, the school outreach tours and other programming. For the
mhm,
museum itself, like, there's been always this plan to create this, like, children's guide. We haven't gotten there. I mean, it would
mhm,
be, we've looked at again examples and had our own desires and hopes. So at this point, no, there's nothing. But how lovely that would be
yeah,
if they could have their walk-through guide and interactive sort of thing to take home of the museum. I think that would be so special.
yeah. Just my last question would be that have you ever been asked this question that why are you recreating these painful memories? And what is your usual response to that?
Why are we recreating them? I think um I mean, this is a very important and very this is a really important question, and this is something that is a debate for a lot of these museums that deal with these very painful memories and situations, and a lot of the Holocaust museums are a big example of this as well, because there are many of them, and I mean they recreate everything from the concentration camps
Mm.
to the, I mean, you know, and some of them, I mean, their pictures are visual. They have a lot of they have a, like, so many very graphic images, videos, all of that. And so I think, and I'm going to borrow from some of the critique that I've read about them, or the conversations I've read about them, because I've used them to think about, you know, why are we doing this. And one of the things that they say, that some of these museums have said, is, look, like, we have been through this huge thing, and we have processed this as a nation, and we believe that you know, trauma is also generational, and it is, it needs to be processed, and then it is always internalized, and it is always passed on. So you know, you will not and I guess this could also be argued that this is true for our histories in South Asia as well, because they are so intertwined and interconnected, to the point where you know, my home becomes your home with some of the journeys, sort of a thing. And there is so much loss that I think one of the suggestions is that there needs to be a place to commemorate, or to just to think through this loss and this trauma, so that we can all see it, we can all acknowledge it, and we can all move on. And I have a personal anecdote relating to this. We went for one interview when we were working on the 71 project, to this gentleman who was a prisoner of war during 71, and he was stuck in Bangladesh for a while. And you know, when I told him I want to, you know, it was someone's sister's friend's uncle, and he you know, he had agreed. He was fine. You know, he had never spoken about it. His own wife really didn't know what had happened. He had never spoken to his children about it, but all we had known is, you know, he had been, for 2 years he hadn't come home, and no one had heard from him. And then when we went to the interview, and this is also all, I mean, every interview was different. We went to the interview, everything was fine, we sat down, and then suddenly something came over him, and he took, and we did not have a video recording. We had a I was we I had a the audio recorder. And then he got this, he was overcome with paranoia, he was overcome with fear. He was definitely reliving everything he had gone through and he had never spoken about. And he said, he took the device, he opened it up, he took out the batteries, and he was just like, what are you trying to do? Are you recording me? Are you going to send this are you going to sell this to the media? Why are you doing this to me? And I mean, it was really upsetting, really heartbreaking. We were at a loss. We've been through some very sad, painful interviews, but you know, this was one of those where it was more than just loss and grief. He was living with those memories and that paranoia and that pain every single day. It was very visible, it was very difficult. And those emotions, those memories had not ever been dealt with, ever been spoken about. And to this day he hasn't spoken about them, and he's quite elderly now. So I mean, this is not to, I mean, this is not to say that a museum can solve these problems, or a museum can create a space that lets you let go of your trauma, or that, you know, will fix this. I'm not even calling it a problem, but this is not to say that creating a memorial or creating a space for contemplation is going to um, help him deal with that. In fact, I feel that someone like him might not even be interested in going to a museum that reminds him of everything. But for a lot of people who we have interviewed, and for a lot of people who have come to the museum, it has been it has been an experience where, so for example, in a lot of the interviews, and we encourage the children of the people we interview to be there, And they, I mean, they hear things that they never ask their parents these things, right? Sometimes some of them share it, sometimes the parents don't share it. They don't ask their parents these things. And I mean, everyone is just, it's this, even just the process of collecting this interview, this oral history, is just such an important process for a family when there's more than one member there. And I've experienced it in so many cases where the family is, the children are hearing for the first time what the parents have gone through, what they've given up, what they've left behind. And it's just, it's, you know, it's always been, it's not always easy, but
Mm.
it's always been an experience that definitely felt important, for the whole family, but definitely for that individuals. Sometimes I would imagine sometimes it's painful because it brings back those memories, but sometimes it is more of a cathartic experience where it is helpful, where their children do finally hear about that, and
Mm.
they do create that space, you know, where they can talk about it. So it's, for me, it's, I really do believe it goes beyond more than just, you know, creating these memorial spaces. I do believe the art, the sort of the act of those interviews and the space they create, I think that is such an important space for the family and what the person went through.
Thank you, Sophia, for answering my questions. If I may just say that, in my view, it's more that CAP is more like a collective healing point. You know, it's more like a communal healing institute that you people have created. Yeah. So thanks.
That's very generous. Thank you.
Thank you, Mavish. Sophia, if I might just add, I mean, I somehow, I don't know if it also, I don't need to simplify it, but just this whole idea of any form of curation and the fact that it becomes a place to bridge spaces, especially in this case, what is not known and known, because the trauma or the hurtful memories usually remain unknown. So why do we only have to tell stories of celebration? And when we say that, you know, we want to talk about the underrepresented, it need not always be communal, it could also be personal. And underrepresented and personal are these difficult spaces. So just this whole idea of saying that, you know, curation is about bridging these known unknown spaces, should sometimes just take care of all different emotions and why just one. I mean, I'm just sort of adding to your thoughts, but also trying to connect with sort of Shobna's question, which is also asking about the missing spaces. So, Shobna, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for your sharing your experiences. Um, in my project, I also have a difficulty with objects. And I just wanted to know your experience of how you dealt with identifying what objects goes with what story, and then also digitizing it. I've also have people have memories of, like, if I interview a 70-year-old, they would have memories of like 1970s, but the magazine is actually not available. So and there's one magazine that is also available, but it's in, you know, in very bad form. It's in tatters. It's very brown. So what I'm trying to get to is, how do you identify the object, and then the digitizing part of it into making it into a traveling digital library, which I love the concept of. If you just very briefly explain that process, that'll be great.
So this is we can't take credit for how we have dealt with objects, because we've seen how other museums have done it, and two museums that I've seen have, and I've never been to one of these. One of the museums that I've been to is, it's called it translates to the House of Terror. It's in Budapest, and it talks about how the city and the country was overcome with first the Nazis, and then the USSR as part of the Iron Curtain. So, you know, it deals with that, and their objects are, a lot of their objects are, the way they've dealt with them are, some of the objects are real, a lot of them are not real, a lot of them are like what they were meant to be, but they've simply just recreated them. So, for example, there are a lot of lockers and bunkers that are part of, where the prisoners used to have to store all of their things before they went to the concentration camps and whatnot. And those are, those are regular, they're very, very important and symbolic part of the stories and of the space visually. But they are regular bunkers, and the way they've related them to these specific stories is by the serial numbers of the prisoners that have been added on, right? So this is not fiction. This is a fabrication, but this is based on, the memories of what did this look like, what did this locker look like, what kind of steel was it, what was the, like, what was your number, what did the numbers go up to. So the whole feel is recreated, and that's something that we also do in various places. So for example, we have and I showed one image. It's there's a recreated refugee tent, and there's a recreated one of the first government of Pakistan offices. So both of these sites or installations are created purely by the oral histories. So we don't have any of these objects. So and the thing is that these objects were nothing to really have. So for example, the refugees that came that didn't have anything, they described the things that either they got for free in the refugee camps, or like they describe them like potlis or lohe ke crates, what the charpais were like, the canvas that was used for the tents, what they drank water in, what they had food in. So these are pieced together with specific details, which, I mean, enough people remember. So
Right.
this is all fabricated. The government of Pakistan office as well, there are no real objects that we had to work with, because they spoke about having very, very um, basic conditions. Like they had a portrait of Jinnah, and then they had these very, very decrepit offices that were leaking, and they were using crates for tables. They were using what they were using to sit on, what typewriter was at the office at the time, if they had money for tea at this point, or they didn't have money for tea. So all of these details from the oral histories, then we go out and we find these objects. Some of them are fabricated, some of them we find from old markets and whatnot, things that are thrown out. None of these objects were precious enough to either exist or be carried on. Then the other way to recreate objects is, so for example, some of them, like some of the stories are, oh, the only thing some people came with a lot of things. So I had my dadi's pandan, I had one sari, I had this, everything is. So again, these, we don't want their real family heirlooms, because we can't take care of them, we can't take that responsibility. So that is again, we find a sari based on what she described, we find an old silver pandan based on what she described. Those are and then the last way to depict objects is, and this is, I guess, how, what did we do this for? We did this for the first passport of Pakistan, and I could say we did this for different kinds of currency. Is that we use some images and some references, and then we use design to make these into very high quality objects that you can see on a tablet that you can zoom into. So again, these details are, the thing is that we can't do anything without the details. So the first passport was made on a paper printed by a French company, and so there was French language in that passport, and the photo was this size, and these were the details. So we found one old passport, and then we worked on it to create something that we don't want people to hold, but because it's digital, we worked with a company to develop an app in which we created the design work, but then they gave us the ability to give it a 360 view, to zoom in, to look at the details. And we were able to do the same thing with currency, which is, I think, the Poland Museum in Warsaw has also done a very good job with zooming into different kinds of currency and metal objects from over the years.
Oh, great. So you recreated or refabricated everything into digital.
Some are physical, like the refugee tent or the government of Pakistan first offices. And then some things are digital, like the passport and different types of currency notes. Yeah.
Oh, great. Good to know. Yeah. And that itself, I mean, the app can be downloaded by anybody and can be looked at, or
the app is right now, it's not downloadable by anybody. It's only in the physical space of the museum.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have two pressing questions. I'm going to take everybody's permission to not go on for too long, but I think this might be of interest to most of us. One is to understand response to COVID. I think it's a but obvious question. I think Johan also had it in his questions. How do you see the kind of work you do, and especially because you emphasized very early on the idea of maintaining physical connection, and you've done it in more than one ways. So how do you see the whole idea of COVID-19 affecting or informing your practice? Any initial thoughts? I know it's way too early on to be able to arrive at something.
So, because now for me, the museum project is complete and I work in an advisory capacity, I'm not going to these interviews anymore. So for me, or I go once in a while if there's something, which is relevant or something. So for me, it's not impacted it as much, but obviously like the generations that the age group that we are after, they're extremely vulnerable. And some of them still want to meet, and they still want, because actually, like, I feel a lot of the elderly folk are, I mean, a lot of them enjoy these meetings with us and they enjoy telling their stories. Some of them don't have family around, and to have these group of, like, they call us all kids, come and talk to them is, I mean, it's, it's sometimes the highlight of some of their days. Like, they serve us like tea and cookies, and they build relationships with some of us. Like, some of the people in the team, like, I mean, they call them up for favors once in a while, like, as in we call them up, and we have that relationship where we can be like, oh, you had told us about this one story, please tell me more about this. Or you had told me about that old sari of yours. Like, these, they build these relationships, and then they also sometimes, I guess, they feel lonely, they want to reach out to us. Or they just, we the our team has built those relationships with them that they just want them to come back. So I feel like some of them want them to come, but it's very dangerous. And obviously, doing interviews online is not the same at all. Especially for that generation, they're much more comfortable in person. However, there are some interviews that have been conducted online. So, for example, even is it I think maybe it was the partition archive based at Berkeley, or I forget who did this, but they had a grandparents project, and a lot of people aren't with their grandparents. So they had already started this ages ago, where they were like, interview your grandparents over Zoom or whatever was the more popular way to Skype, I guess. Yeah. So interview them on Skype and ask them these questions. And a lot of these, I guess, programs are online. We always weren't very much. We were always doing it more in person. And this, I mean, COVID definitely complicates it a lot, because they're the most vulnerable. But I mean, online is not enough to conduct the interviews. Like, it's not substitute enough to continue collecting these stories, I feel personally.
So one is collection of stories, but also the whole experience which you have been creating, I mean, subtly you have spoken about recreating and sort of questioning the museum experience, so that this whole physical connect, the experience of it, uh, sort of flows through. It's not only about listening to stories, because I think in today's day and age, it might be more convenient if I give you a web link and listen to all stories, but that's not going to happen. So you're investing so much of energy through your curation in creating experiences. And now the question is, can I even visit a museum, and how many people at a time, and who will sit next to whom? So do you have any apprehensions or sort of solutions for things like these in your
I mean,
mind?
I guess some of the recreations of museum spaces through Google's Arts and Culture, and then also a lot of the galleries have shifted to these online gallery spaces. I guess it's very cool, but it's not, the accessibility is obviously not there. For one, you need a good internet connection and a device. So I guess we lose a lot of people through that access. Like, when I mean, they opened it again, but obviously they had closed the museum in the middle, and now I mean, things are not looking good, so they might just close it again.
Yeah.
But obviously, I mean, you can't, I don't think anything can make up for even
Right.
a fantastic documentation and 360 view and the best technology. Because the thing is that the space is not, it's the whole idea. And I spoke about the site and the crowds that come there, and you know, the problem of accessibility. I don't think the online, I mean, online cannot, although so many people have smartphones, it's obviously not going to be the same. I think all museums just will have to wait it out, and some are adapting better just because their audience is online and
Hmm.
comfortable with being online and has access. But I mean, ours is not. So, and we also, it costs a lot of money
Yeah.
to create those virtual experiences, which I mean is not there right now.
Right. And my second question was really about cultural differences. If you noticed any, I mean, to be a curator, having sort of studied abroad, but also traveled and seen other museums as you kept giving us references, or even your interactions with other curators. I was just curious if you noticed that there were cultural influences and differences on how curatorship is sort of understood and sort of portrayed from one place to another. So did you feel that just because you're working in Pakistan, in Karachi, in your home grounds, you sort of performed a certain way versus if you were back in the States, your idea of curatorship would have been different?
I wouldn't have been able to be the lead curator of such a huge project if I was anywhere else in the world. I have to, I mean, I have to just, and also like, I don't know if I mean, we've named me a curator, but I have not, you know, got a PhD in curatorial, this and that. And that's the thing with like these small organizations where everyone does everything and wears a lot of hats, that we do everything and we experience everything, and then with us, like once in a while we get this massive opportunity to do something like this. We never thought we would do something like this, and to be honest, I mean, it's not, I don't even know how long it lasts. Like, I'm calling it our most permanent space, but the way things work in Pakistan, and with governments changing, and the thing is that it's a political project. It was made by um, a political party that is no longer in power. We don't know the future of it. Like, we'll try and we hope it'll stick around because we worked so hard, but we don't know how permanent this space is going to be. So that's one thing. The other thing is, yeah, I think abroad I would have had to. I don't know. I see myself very lucky and privileged to have worked on this project. I don't think abroad I would have been offered this kind of opportunity. I think we were already doing something and had done stuff in our own way for so long that when they were looking for someone to do this, we had this like entire like roster of things that we had done.
Hmm.
And yeah, like, you know, curator is such a like fancy word. Like, I don't like, I'm calling myself that, but I'm also sort of like, you know, shying away at calling myself that, because I mean, the curators of the museums that I've been studying and visited, like, they are, you know, extremely like important, distinguished people who've done all these really important things, and I've not done, like, I'm not yeah, I can't compare myself to those
Yeah.
people like
I think one answer is we don't compare ourselves, but the other answer is maybe there are different definitions for the idea of a curator. Where I was
I
perhaps
think.
going with this is the kind of global the context in the global south we are looking at, and the kind of interdependencies, the kind of uncertainties that we sort of end up working with, and hence the demand of the role of a curator. I mean, the way you said you couldn't have done it somewhere else, I would even question which other. I mean, to be a renowned curator in a museum which has all its systems established versus
Yeah.
resolving certain pragmatic issues the way you spoke about, on ground realities which you dealt with. I would wonder which other curator from, say, established museum would want to come and deal with those very iffy spaces, iffy. So it's both ways around. And what I was really getting at is the whole idea of, is there a need to evaluate or look at the word curator when we look at the global south or the kind of context we are working in, and not necessarily borrow from the Western academy.
Yeah, I mean I think that's a really important question and
Yeah.
consideration. And I mean, I spoke in the beginning about how all of our systems, somehow we've looked at stuff and then we've had to localize them.
Yeah.
This is our way of working. Anything we do, we looked at what was there and then we just adapted because no model exactly fit our set of conditions or contexts. So I think that is what we do with everything. Yeah.
Right. Wonderful. I'm assuming there are no more questions because there's nothing in the document or the chat. I surely would like to read out Sarita's comment. I think it's a good closing comment. So Sarita is a curator and designer from Bangalore. She was here with us until 6:30 and then she had a call. But she's just added into the question earlier, which is this conversation on the possible conflict between the power of design and, power of design versus the resultant compromise on the content from a curatorial perspective. And this very unease that I had felt and encountered was the reason I've often attempted to traverse both worlds. So I think she was adding it back to the question we started off with, is the conflict between the researcher, the archivist, and the curator. And I think it remains unresolved and exciting. Yeah. So I just wanted to read that out for your information. So with that note, Sophia, thank you so much for making time and sharing your project and your experiences with us. I think it really helps to know that we all share similar spaces and difficulties and aspirations. Anybody else, any questions, comments, thoughts?
Just one thing, I think it's commendable. From the sense I get is that the negotiation that took place as your role, with different interests, political interests, social interests, whatever it was, I think that is quite an amazing role that you played in that, and it's with grace, I think, to come up to such a level of museum and putting it out there. It's quite amazing. It's very inspirational. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's really humbling to hear. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions and your patience. I mean, this was quite long. Ishita, thank you for moderating so well.
Thank you, Sophia. I think everyone else is also sharing their gratitude. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and wish you all a good evening and a wonderful Sunday ahead.